Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Are you all caught up on AMC's Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire? 3 episodes are out now on AMC+. We are almost halfway through the season. Episode 3. Okay, of all the 5 episodes that I got to watch early of the show, this is my favorite episode. What? Did you think that just because I have criticisms means I don't like this show? That I'm not enjoying it? I'm here in my lair making hours and hours of content devoted to it. I am clearly obsessed. I'd say my order of favorite to least so far goes episode 3, 5, 1, 4, 2. All the episodes have their great little moments that I absolutely love, as a fan. Even despite the many things that I could criticize about the show, just as a show. As we discussed last time, episode 2 is my least favorite because the story it's trying to tell is so muddled and inconsistent. Like I mentioned from the start, I don't mind that the show is different from the books. I've always had a place in my heart for extreme AU retellings. What I'm interested in here is what those differences do to the meaning of the vampire and the new vampire themes that emerge to resonate with audiences compared to the themes that captured fans when Anne Rice wrote the books 40 years ago. Different doesn't mean bad, but those differences are really interesting to me, and that's why we're here to talk about them all. But like we said last time, episode 2 spent a lot of time contradicting itself. It would set up one element of character development based on its own internal logic driven by the changes made to the story, only for its efforts of including plot points or dialogue from the books to end up undermining the direction it had been building. I honestly just wish they had let the show be more of its own thing and go in its own directions, because shoehorning in moments from the book, like the scene with the opera singer last time, just didn't work with the way Louis's vampire journey had already been going. Also, still mad about the way it tried to sweep off the table any criticism of the negative racist implications of Louis and Lestat's relationship and say that the racial aspect isn't important and that Daniel questioning it was just a cheap journalism tactic. It should be questioned and discussed and unpacked. Minimizing and attempting to preemptively silence audience criticism of the very real issues that come up in interracial relationships is the exact opposite of what a show like this should be doing. In the books, Louis and Lestat's relationship is already messy. It is passionately toxic, and making it an interracial relationship makes it so much more messy in so many other layers that should be interrogated on deep levels, not just hand-waved away with a shallow passing jab to check the discussion off a list. So yeah, episode 2 is at the bottom of my faves, but episode 3 digs all into the messiness of their relationship, and I am so here for it. A new writer has joined the script team for this episode, Hannah Moscovich, the first woman writer we get so far, and a new director on this episode. Keith Powell takes over from Alan Taylor, who had directed the first 2, and I am sure that their contributions are to thank for why I personally think this episode just works so much better than the last one. It's a lot. It's not perfect, but I'll take it. As usual, all the spoilers ahead, so if you haven't watched episode 3 yet, go watch it now and come back to me as soon as you are ready. Episode 3. Is my very nature that of a devil? For the first time, we open without our framing device. No Dubai, no Daniel, no interview, plunging us straight back into Louis' story. It seems he and Lestat have resumed their domestic bliss, or at least a semblance of it, as they sit comfortably reading together on location in New Orleans' famous Jackson Square. There's nothing here to indicate just how much time has passed since the end of episode 2, but we do eventually find out much later on in the episode that it's been about 5 months since the scene where they ate the opera singer together, and Louis told us that he was just pretending to enjoy killing so that he wouldn't disappoint Lestat. Lestat has a newspaper, and Louis is reading Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man. And when Lestat talks about enjoying an article about the origins of Jackson Square, Louis asks if the article mentions how the square was once used to showcase brutality against runaway slaves. Lestat responds by making a little joke out of it that doesn't bother Louis at all, showing us that while racism is still very much on Louis's mind, it's not something that comes between them in their interracial relationship. Though racial struggles are one of Louis's greatest conflicts in the show so far, indeed the main driving factor that made him choose to become a vampire, and the thing he'd appreciated about being a vampire the most, with eating the racists, it seems the show wants us to accept that Lestat is not part of that particular conflict for him. Because now that they are both vampires, they are equals. In the quiet dark. Lestat's whole big selling point on becoming a vampire was that it would set Louis free from the way humanity oppressed him, racially and sexually, and then Lestat's frustration with Louis in episode 2 was how he clung to his human attachments and therefore didn't actually get the benefits of freedom that vampirism was meant to provide. Lestat here thinks that if Louis just embraces his vampire nature, racism and homophobia will magically stop existing for him entirely. But Louis isn't ready for that. Yet. The show trying to spin it this way, Lestat's not a racist, really. He's the bestest ally. Anything you thought he was doing that seemed racist was just true love, actually. Is a bit of a double-edged sword, because even if it worked and everyone believed that, then it plays into the racist white savior trope. There really is no way to avoid their relationship coming off as racially problematic, no matter how much the show seems to want to insist that it's not. And it's frustrating how quick the show was to dismiss that. But the nice thing about this little moment here between them on the park bench, compared to the ham-fisted attempts in episode 2, is that they are at least showing us their dynamic in a very subtle and nuanced way, instead of just having Louis tell Daniel, aka the audience, what we're supposed to think about it. Already, episode 3 is immersing us in the intimate moments of their domestic life together that mostly all got skipped over or summed up in narration in the last episode. They didn't even get a montage of their years together, just a complete skip. Anyway, tonight Louis has been inspired by the Darwin book he's reading, thinking about how humans evolved from apes and applying it to vampires as being evolved beings beyond humans. That makes him wonder if they should serve some higher purpose on Earth. Lestat thinks this is stupid and says a vampire's purpose is to enjoy life. But Louis wants to believe there's more to it than that, some meaning in their existence. And this is straight out of the book, and Louis' existential turmoil as Anne Rice wrote it, and I am so glad the show finally got here. Only took this Louis 7 years. Louis and Lestat having philosophical debates about the purpose of vampiric existence is a key part of their relationship. And as far as the showrunners promising their alternate universe keeps to the heart of Anne Rice, this is one of those bits right here. However, the show takes a very different twist on what those philosophies actually are for each of them. First, Louis mentions that instead of killing people, they can drink the blood of animals and be okay, which I wonder when he learned this. We saw him drink an animal in modern times, but this is the first time it's come up in his story. In the book, it's one of the first things Lestat taught him, but here we've never seen him learn it or try it in all his years of being a vampire. Lestat immediately points out that just being okay is no way to live, so Louis drops it and instead suggests that they kill only evildoers instead of innocent people. Lestat dismisses this as a stupid idea at once, explaining that even though they can read minds, there's no way to know if someone is truly evil unless they happen to be actively thinking about their evil deeds at the exact moment their mind is read, and that they would starve while they were waiting around to find someone like that. Also, he points out that all people are equally capable of evil, and if they were in certain circumstances where they knew for sure they would absolutely not be held accountable in any way, most people might just as well do anything an evil person would do. He calls applying reason and rationality to killing instead of letting it be completely random a set of leg irons that would destroy his reason for existence, which is enjoying himself. Wow. Okay. Big change here, huh? Back in episode 1, when Lestat said that he brings death to those deserving, I thought he was referring to how in the books he focuses on only killing evildoers. Most of the time. Not always. Sometimes he messes up. But for the most part, it is his MO, and he gets a huge thrill out of using his mind reading to stalk them down and make a big old hunt out of it, no matter how long he has to wait. When the showrunners told us that a major part of their version of the story was that they wanted to incorporate later canon Lestat to correct all the things Louis lied about him in the book, this was one of those big things I thought they were going to include. In Louis's book, he talks about Lestat's sadistic hunting practices and his sympathy for the victims, seeing himself as superior to Lestat in all ways because Louis kills indiscriminately and quickly without making some sick game out of it. But in The Vampire Lestat, we find out that all those victims Louis was trash-talking Lestat for killing were actually evildoers all along. And Lestat's not even that bad, if he says so himself. This is one of the biggest things that the later books correct about Lestat that I had thought would be, kind of top of the list for what this show is going to incorporate in its version. But no, here it is Louis's idea from the start, and Lestat thinks it's completely stupid. And when they go out to give it a try at Louis's insistence, it turns out Lestat is right. They find an evildoer, and Lestat pins him for Louis so that he can feed, but Louis still can't bring himself to do it. Even though the scent of the blood is making him ravenous, he instead grabs a conveniently nearby cat, it was just sitting there, so handy, and chows down on that instead. Like for Louis in the book, premeditated murder is too much. He can't stand actually thinking about who he kills. In the book, if a person he was about to kill even so much as looks at him, he will turn around and walk away. He can only bear to do it if he is completely ignorant of whose life he is ending. And in that way, he's actually one of the most ruthless of all the vampires we meet in the entire series, because most of the others are more selective, either choosing evildoers or suicidal people or some other method that helps ease their conscience. For a show that's been so insistent and intentional about showing Lestat as a more romantic figure than Louis's book did, it's fascinating that they took the only kill evildoers thing away from him. Even the 1994 movie included that bit as one of the very few things they pulled from The Vampire Lestat. And, in fact, this scene in the show mirrors the scene from the movie where Lestat tries to get Louis to kill the murderous widow, and Louis ends up eating her poodles instead. Far more than any scene actually found in the books. After Louis's kill evildoers idea crashes and burns immediately, Lestat is upset because he feels Louis is ashamed to be a vampire. The entire point of becoming a vampire, to be Lestat's immortal companion, was to live a new life, free of shame. Not only is Louis still insisting on keeping up his business in the human world and therefore facing the shame of racism from the white businessmen and still exposed to the shame of being gay, now he's also ashamed of being a vampire? When Lestat derides his nightclub, Louis defends it, saying that it also fronts a dozen businesses in town, using his privilege to help support small business owners, making their dreams come true. Lestat mocks him for his delusion of heroism, reminding him that he is still a killer, and then Louis tells him, finally, that he doesn't want to kill people anymore. Even though Lestat does not like this decision, he doesn't argue, just warns Louis that it's going to be hard for him. Living off animals is a struggle that will leave Louis feeling constantly weak and depleted. He'll be okay, but okay is no way to live. But Louis is convinced that he has plenty else to live for. His business is thriving, and he got that social status success he said in the last episode was everything he ever wished for. While they're having this conversation, they are watching a performance by the club's new singer, Antoinette. This is a character loosely based on one from the Chronicles. In the book, after Claudia's mind grows up and she decides that she hates Lestat and starts, plotting to murder him, Louis seizes up with inaction and passivity, and he lets things just get worse and worse, and Lestat feels like he's losing both of them. So he goes out and finds a new human lover who he's thinking about making into a vampire. Not to, replace Louis and Claudia, but to bring him in to join them, to restore a sense of balance to the family. Louis and Claudia have each other, and Lestat will not feel so emotionally abandoned if he has someone of his own. Although he has no name in the book, we find out in Prince Lestat that this character's name is Antoine. He is a musician who reminds Lestat of his long-lost violinist ex-boyfriend, Nicky. Here, Antoine has been reimagined as Antoinette, no longer a pianist and a composer, but a jazz singer, and she's brought into the story much earlier than Antoine appears in the book. We can tell that Lestat is instantly attracted to her, and the show has well established how he feels about music and musicians. Now, the thing that sets her apart from any other talented person he might admire is finding her at a moment in his life when he's feeling rejection from Louis. In the book, it was Louis pulling away because of the strife between Lestat and Claudia, but here it's Louis being ashamed of being a vampire, which Lestat takes personally as the vampire, of course. Now, the fact that the show has gender-bent Antoine is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's erasing a canon male-male relationship and a gay male character, essentially straightwashing to show Lestat's love affair with a woman now instead of another man, and after the show straightwashed Daniel, that's 2 strikes against it. However, on the other hand, there are frustratingly few female characters in the Vampire Chronicles, especially in the early books, and creating another role for a woman is a nice thing. Also, this helps illustrate Lestat's bisexuality, since that doesn't otherwise get an opportunity to be shown until later books. I just hope that we also get to see him with other men as well at some point, so that he doesn't fall into that problematic trope of a man only being interested in one man, and that makes it okay, and all the rest of his experiences are straight, because so far Lestat only has eyes for Louis. We'll see, I guess, we'll see. In an abrupt change of subject, Lestat insists that the club's piano player, still Jelly Roll Morton, that actual famous historical figure who claimed to have invented jazz, has lost his passion for the piano, and Lestat starts heckling him from the audience. When Lestat is challenged if he can do any better, he goes up on stage, and Louis is overcome with secondhand embarrassment, warning Lestat that this isn't his kind of music, which at first seems justified when Lestat starts playing the minuet in G major, and it gets the audience booing him immediately. But then he surprises everyone by suddenly playing jazz, and the crowd goes wild, all while he's gazing lovingly at Louis across the room. Lestat is thoroughly enjoying himself, living his reason for existence, showing Louis that he can find pleasure in anything, even where it doesn't seem he belongs. Fun fact. In 1917, where this scene takes place, everyone thought that the minuet in G major was composed by Bach. And Lestat references this when he says that the man who wrote it had 20 children, and therefore must have been a very sexy guy, making it a good song to play in a brothel. But in 1970, the world found out that this piece was actually written by somebody else. I think it's neat that the show keeps in this historical inaccuracy, because there's no way Lestat would have known better at the time. He may have been friends with Don Zanetti, but Bach was way before him. He's not that old. The other reason why Lestat puts on this little demonstration is that he'd found out Jelly Roll was going to quit abruptly and leave Louis' club without a band leader, seriously impacting his business while he scrambled to find new entertainment. But now, the crowd wants Jazzman Lestat, so Jelly Roll's sudden departure neither affects the business nor publicly humiliates Louis for getting dumped. Lestat to the rescue! How sweet. See? Episode 2 kept telling us that Lestat was thoughtful and charming and loving, but here we actually get to see it. Little things he does for Louis that are ostensibly out of love. Not fighting him on wanting to eat animals, even though it personally makes him feel rejected. Saving the day with his piano playing. The elements of white saviorism are still here, of course, and not being acknowledged. But given what they have to work with, I love these little moments. And the reason they're finally succeeding in this episode, I think, is because unlike the previous 2, this one isn't trying so hard to make sure it wedges in scenes whole cloth from the books. Episode 2 just didn't work for me because when it came to the parts lifted from Anne Rice, they just felt disjointed, not following the natural logic set up by the changes the show made. Trying to stick too close to the books, like the scene with the opera singer and other parts that directly contradicted the lore set up earlier in the very same episode, was to the show's detriment. And in episode 3, you'll see that though there are ideas from the book, the evildoers, eating animals, Antoinette, the actual scene-by-scene way they're used is much more original, making this episode just a whole lot more immersive and fun. Darkly fun, because for the most part, it's just letting itself be its own thing. When Louis tells Daniel that Lestat was the real composer of one of actual historical figure Jelly Roll Morton's most famous songs, Daniel stops the interview to question his memory. Louis admits that time can make recollection fuzzy on the minute details. But Daniel says it's not the details he cares about, but the total rewrite of Louis' first interview. He takes a moment to play the tapes of quotes directly from the book of Louis saying how horrible and stupid and repulsive Lestat is, and then compares them to the recordings from earlier today of Louis talking about admiring Lestat and feeling so connected to him. Daniel thinks the story Louis is telling him now might actually be the lie, because now he's had 50 years to come up with this and rehearse it. It's not spontaneous anymore. He's concerned that Louis is minimizing his abuse at Lestat's hands, and he's too close to see how awful Lestat really was. Abuse victims often still love their abusers. Louis shuts that right down, saying he does not consider himself abused. And it's these past 50 years that have given him the clarity to realize that. Again, like in episode 2, preemptively silencing the audience from getting any ideas about seeing Lestat as deliberately emotionally manipulative. And that the whole premise of this new interview is that Louis wants to correct what he said about Lestat on the tapes. The show really wants us to accept all of Lestat's actions as coming from a place of genuine love. Misguided and selfish on a subconscious level, perhaps, obviously, but not intentionally misleading or coercive. Daniel ends up accepting this, just like the show wants the audience to do, and in a demonstration of good faith, he throws out the old tapes and deletes his digital copies of the recordings. Louis then seals the understanding by using his mind to set the tapes on fire. Well, this is new. Now, not only can Louis read minds and take a little drink in the modern era, but he can also use the fire gift. Considering that the events of Queen of the Damned haven't happened yet, and Lestat hasn't yet gotten his epic power-up that he then passes on to Louis years later, Louis, the weakest, most human of all vampires, being able to use the fire gift is extremely unexpected. I do hope that there is a story behind this. Maybe Louis received some super ancient powerful blood from another source. Or the TV show has just decided to change the way vampires work, and now young ones like Louis can have this power. And also, no compunction showing off using it, seeming to enjoy freaking Daniel out a little bit with it, emphasizing that this version of Louis is not repulsed by his inhumanness, his monstrous powers. He thinks they're cool. Despite what's going on in the story, where he's now regressed to eating animals after 6 years having fun eating racists, in the modern era, he's embraced his vampire alienness. Can't wait to see how he got to this point. Back to his story. 2 weeks go by with Lestat performing nightly at the club, working closely with Antoinette until Louis can find a replacement pianist. Meanwhile, Louis hired a guy to deliver him a basket o' rats every night, which he chows down on, lonely in the backyard, while Lestat and Antoinette and their pals party in the house. When Daniel assumes that Lestat was eating these party people, Louis says actually Lestat only killed away from home now to support Louis' murder-free lifestyle. What a guy! But the side effect of living off rats is that Louis loses all of his strength and energy. He says he can barely even hold up a book, and so he's neglecting his romance with Lestat. He has no libido anymore, and he tells us he understands that Lestat ends up filling this gap with his growing relationship with Antoinette. After his last night performing with her, they pop champagne to celebrate their run together, and when she asks Louis to convince Lestat to keep playing, Lestat says no, he only did it for Louis, that he would do anything for Louis. This prompts Antoinette to ask about the rumors that they're a gay couple, and though they don't give her a straight answer, she gets confused when Lestat takes his flirting to the next level and starts getting physical with her, and then uses music metaphors to explain that he's actually bi and poly. Louis annoyed, but he doesn't stop it because he knows he's too weak and exhausted to put out himself, so he leaves, saying he's hungry and going to get something to eat. Given that bloodlust is conflated with actual lust in the series, it implies he's aroused as well, but bitter about it. As he leaves, he resentfully tells them to enjoy themselves, quoting Lestat's philosophy back to him that it's the purpose of living. But But Lestat doesn't let this judgmental jab get to him, and he undresses Antoinette and goes to town. Later, Louis comes home, assuming Lestat's killed her, but finds out that he let her live because she has musical talent. This is finally too much for Louis, and in a rare moment of vulnerability, he asks Lestat if he's not enough for him. And after Lestat's been feeling so previously rejected, this revolution that Louis actually cares enough to be jealous absolutely delights him, and he bursts into laughter. At first, Louis thinks he's mocking him, but then Lestat runs over and hugs him because he's just so happy to know that Louis actually cares. He tells Louis that since they'll be together for eternity, it's important that they find ways to keep themselves entertained. For Lestat, that's the pleasures of the flesh and killing. For Louis, that's a good book by the fire, and Lestat accepts that about him. But he needs occasional variety in his own life to keep immortality from becoming dull. Lestat thinks this is a great conversation, and he's still so happy to actually have gotten some emotional vulnerability from Louis, and he kisses him. But Louis is not feeling it because he is still jealous. Louis says, "So I can fuck whoever I want then?" And Lestat, clearly thrown by the question, winning the Protest Too Much award of the night, tells him, of course. 4 times. As long as Louis comes home to him. Of course, of course, of course, of course. Whoever he wants. Clearly, he's hoping this never actually ends up happening. Considering that Louis is living off rats and has no libido, Lestat should be safe, right? Wrong. In the very next scene, an old flame of Louis comes to town. This is Jonah, who, unlike Antoinette, is not based on anyone from the books. He is a soldier in the army, and he ends up at Louis' club because it's one of the only ones in Storyville now that still allows mixing of races after a new law has been passed. In a poker game with his white business friends, Louis tells them he got around the law by making his sex workers part owners of his brothel. But they warn him that it won't work for long. With the war going on, Woodrow Wilson is cracking down on sex work and other vices. The Prohibition era is right around the corner. And in order for the white politicians to stall for time to keep their own businesses afloat, they're going after black businesses first. Louis feels particularly betrayed by Alderman Fenwick, the same poker buddy who offered him the 15% job in the first episode that he ended up turning down to buy his current club. When Jonah shows up, it's a welcome distraction, and he and Louis reminisce about old times. Lestat is watching them closely from the balcony while he makes out with Antoinette, but he does nothing to stop Louis and Jonah from getting out of there and going someplace more private, probably hoping that Louis will actually kill this guy. And because this is New Orleans, the best private place is apparently way out in the middle of the bayou. Louis asks Jonah if he's worried about going to war, but Jonah says he's actually looking forward to Europe because he's heard that they're more accepting of black people and gay people there. He says none of this out loud in so many words, by the way. Their conversation in these scenes is all entirely subtextual, and it is so well done. They both keep feeling each other out until the understanding dawns that, yes, their teenage fumbling experience together wasn't a mistake, and they are both, in fact, gay and do want each other right now. Louis tells Jonah that he has someone, but they have an agreement for an open relationship. Jonah asks what Lestat is like, and Louis says, he's a lot. It's not perfect. And then they start making out, and Jonah gives Louis oral sex. Of course, Louis' bloodlust kicks in, but to keep from hurting his friend, he bites his own arm. Oh, Louis. Why didn't you think about trying that when you almost ate the baby? Now, this is the first indication we've gotten that the show has actually changed the lore from the books about vampires and sex. In the books, although vampires' circulatory system is indeed very active and they often get erections, they have absolutely zero desire to use them. When vampires are aroused, all they want to do is drink blood and kill. There are examples where a vampire uses his erection for sex despite not wanting to, but they are also incapable of human orgasm or ejaculation. The orgasmic feeling they get when drinking blood and killing covers their entire body, and it isn't at all connected to their groin like it is for humans. In episode 1, though Louis and Lestat get naked, they don't actually have sex. Instead of putting his penis in him, Lestat only puts his fangs in Louis, and Louis says getting his blood drunk was the most intimate experience of his existence, like a drug high multiplied to the rings of Saturn. Which, side note, how come Damek doesn't feel anything like that when Louis drinks from him at the dinner table? You see what I mean about episode 2? But yeah, no actual sex in episode 1, just metaphorical vampire sex. And earlier in this episode, they cut away from Lestat with Antoinette. We don't know if they had actual sex or if he just drank her blood. Same goes for whatever he was doing with Miss Lily in episode 1. And we've never seen any indication of bedroom activity between Louis and Lestat again over the 7 years since the first time. So far, we could believe that the canon rules about vampires and sex have been kept. Or at least that the show meant to leave it ambiguous enough that people could think so. But here, with Jonah giving Louis a blowjob, something specifically connected to his genitals, and Louis being so into it, it proves that the sex rule has changed. And Louis climaxes from the experience, and there's nothing about it that makes Jonah find him at all inhuman. And if that's the case, now I'm wondering why Louis and Lestat's relationship turned so PG after they became vampires. Episode 1 was so generous with the romantic stuff, and then nothing after it again. Bait and switch much, AMC? Anyway, unlike almost eating the baby, Louis isn't broken up about his bloodlust for Jonah at all this time, and he goes home to awkwardly get ready for bed with Lestat. When Louis addresses the giant elephant in the room, saying that he didn't go looking for a lover, that Jonah just showed up, Lestat asks if they have a history. And Louis mentions their teenage experimenting and connection over their closeted queerness. Lestat pretends to be fine with this, and then he tells Louis that he dumped Antoinette, that he got bored of her, and then he asks Louis if they can have a date night tomorrow. Louis says that he wants to visit his family first, which Lestat is visibly upset by, how Louis keeps putting him off to cling to his humanity, but Lestat says fine, and he goes to bed, to coffin. Before Louis gets in his own coffin, he notices Lestat's boots on the floor, covered in mud, which makes him suspicious that Lestat had gone out to the muddy bayou as well. Back with Daniel, Louis says, well, the mud could have come from anywhere, and Daniel asks him if it was raining that night. And Louis says he can't actually remember. And they reference once more the odyssey of recollection, the way memories can change in our minds over the years, painting the past in different lights, depending on where we've come in the present. 50 years ago, Louis only remembered his life with Lestat negatively. But now he's remembering it as if they were soulmates in a fucked up gothic romance, as Daniel puts it. So what has happened to Louis over the past 50 years of his vampire life to bring him to this new mindset? When do we get to hear that story? While they talk, Louis' chief human servant, Rashid, makes them martinis in the background. We've seen the vampires drinking alcohol often in the brothel scenes, but it was unclear whether they were just faking it to fool humans, forcing it down even though it tastes like soap, like he did with the ice cream, or if they somehow actually enjoy the drinks. Like with the sex, the show has left it ambiguous so far, so that we could plausibly think vampires still don't actually drink anything but blood. But if it is just an act, why does Rashid here make 2 martinis? Louis said his self-flagellation was only eating 1 human dish a week, and he already did that today. So can vampires here enjoy alcohol? It is neither questioned nor explained. This whole bit seems to only be here to remind us that Rashid exists. Louis chastises him for lingering and kicks him out of the room and then resumes his conversation with Daniel. Like I said before, I have theories about Rashid, but wait till the next episode. It was when I watched episode 4 that made me go from thinking my theory is just like some crack idea to being like, oh shit, maybe I was right all along. We'll talk about that next week. Put a pin in that for now. Back to Louis' story, we see him go visit his family, but his mom tells him that he is not welcome. She still hates him, not just blaming him for Paul's death and for thinking he's gay, but now also because she thinks he's the devil. She says the family is afraid of him. It's not clear why. It's been 6 months since he saw them last, but maybe she's been getting like bad vibes off him over the past vampire years and can sense the monster within him. Louis loses his temper and kicks in the front door, but he accidentally uses too much of his vampire strength and the whole thing smashes down the hall, terrifying his family and making even his sister reject him this time. His mom grabs his face and looks in his eyes, saying, "There he is," by which she means the devil. She legitimately thinks her son has been taken over by the actual devil of her Catholic faith. Louis is horrified with himself and goes home, but this time, instead of crying in bed while his husband soothingly wipes his tears away, he walks into a party. His house is full of drunken white soldiers singing raucously while Lestat leads them on the piano. Louis is even more upset that they're all upstairs where nobody is usually allowed to go, afraid that they'll find the coffins, but Lestat dismisses his worries and explains that he invited them over to party after the power got cut at Louis' club, and it was issued a temporary closure notice. Louis is devastated and orders Lestat to get rid of everybody. Lestat makes a quip about now that he knows Louis is into soldiers after getting with Jonah, he thought he'd be pleased. Louis insists. And because Lestat can never say no to him, he immediately uses his psychic vampire powers to hypnotize every soldier in the house and send them marching out the door. This apparently is rather difficult for him, as it makes his ears bleed and he collapses into a chair. Is this something Lestat can do in the books? Kind of. Strong vampires do have the ability to influence mortal minds. For instance, if they wanted to take off flying, they can push the minds of everyone around them to not notice. But controlling this many people on a level to actually make them all simultaneously stop what they're doing and walk out the door like mindless robots is a much huger display of the hypnotic powers than we ever see in the books. Especially for a vampire as young as Lestat is here, before he gets his ancient blood power-up in Queen of the Damned. He's only 150, even though he's much older than Louis in this version. That's still a baby in vampire terms in a series where many big characters are thousands of years old. No idea yet if the show gave Lestat this huge boost in his vampire powers as setup for some later purpose, or just because they thought it would be a cool vampire moment. We'll see. I haven't seen the last 2 episodes yet. Lestat exhaustedly not apologizes by quoting Louis' words to Jonah from the night before.
I'm a lot.
And now Louis knows the mud on the boots meant that Lestat was spying on him. Lestat admits he's jealous, and when Louis asks why Lestat can be with Antoinette but he can't be with Jonah, Lestat says it's different because he doesn't have feelings for her, but Louis has this whole past with Jonah. And then they start screaming at each other. And it comes out that at the bottom of it, Lestat is mad about Louis eating animals. If Louis had never started eating animals, he wouldn't have lost his libido, and their affairs never would have started in the first place.
This is not a life! That's because you took my life!
Now, for the first time in their whole life together that we've seen, Louis is blaming Lestat as being the one to make him a vampire and seduce him into a gay relationship for him losing his family, and now even his business getting closed, which he says is the last fucking thing he cares about. Ouch, Louis. Lestat's right there. But we don't get to see Lestat's reaction to Louis implying he doesn't care about him, whether he's deeply hurt by it or dismissive again. It cuts right to the next scene, where Louis is arguing about the closure of his club with the white businessman, and Lestat is sitting by calmly. He eventually chimes into the conversation to help point out that Black-owned businesses are getting shut down during this political war over brothels, while the white-owned ones are still doing all right. The businessmen argue that they will all be affected. Storyville is on its last legs. Prohibition is imminent. Everyone in the vice business is about to be in a very tough spot. They suggest Louis use Lestat's white privilege to open up a speakeasy instead and run his brothel in secret. But Lestat says he won't get involved. He will sit by patiently while Louis clings to his human life and connections, but he's not about to start any of his own. I guess he gave up pretty fast on trying to break Louis of chasing after phantoms of his former self, huh? Using his mind-reading powers, Louis hears Alderman Fenwick thinking racist things about him and realizes his white poker buddies screwed him over by selling him a club that was doomed to failure. When they patronizingly offer to buy it back from him for 15%, the same cut Fenwick had offered Louis to run his club years ago, Louis reaches his limit. After his mother called him the devil, he's starting to believe it now himself, and we get our episode title drop.
Is my very nature that of the devil?
And like the other episodes, even though it's a quote straight from the book, it is used in a very different context here. In the book, Louis' fears that he's from the devil stem from his overwhelming guilt about his monstrous nature, Not just the being a murderer part, but all the powers and everything else that makes him inhuman. His Catholic upbringing makes him truly believe he's damned by becoming a vampire, but he's still so confused and conflicted by why he still has feelings of goodness. If he is a devil, shouldn't those have gone away? And as he's anguishing and suffering over this, he starves himself in penance until he begins to go mad with thirst, which then leads him to feed on Claudia, breaking his vow to live off animals and starting a chain reaction that leads to the entire story. In the show, it's not feelings of guilt, but feelings of rage. And here, Louis thinks that if he is of the devil, he might as well act like one. In manic, stubborn defiance, he puts up a sign on his brothel that says it's for coloreds only. They won't let him have an integrated brothel? Fine. Instead of it making whites only like everyone else, he does the opposite. It's segregated, isn't it? The police and politicians aren't amused and come up with sham reasons to shut down his business for good. During all this, he neglects his thirst, just like in the book, but not out of penance this time. He's just too busy to remember to eat. Also, instead of that leading to him feeding on an innocent child, this time he takes his fury out on Alderman Fenwick for hypocritically outwardly spreading propaganda about how terrible brothels are for the moral society, while meanwhile he'd been one of their greatest customers. We then get a rather unnecessary moment of Daniel's voiceover spelling it out for the audience that Louis's rage stems from being a black man in America, and now that he has super vampire powers, people will be sorry for fucking with him. So, Louis uses his powers to break into Alderman Fenwick's house, surprising him in his pajamas. Fenwick makes a speech about how he's not racist, but Louis is arrogant for not accepting his place in the world as a black man. And then he makes some digs at Louis for being gay. Louis quietly starts to intimidate him, freaking Fenwick out by reading his mind. And then Fenwick shoots him twice in the shoulder, which doesn't even make Louis flinch. Now Fenwick's really scared, and Louis finally drops the calm, collected, respectful act and lets his inner devil out. He uses his vampire speed to slice off Fenwick's ear and then cut into him a few times with his weaponized vampire fingernails. Blood is spraying everywhere. Cut to the next day, when a woman in Jackson Square screams upon seeing Fenwick's disemboweled body hanging off the iron gate. Similar to how Louis mentioned at the beginning of the episode that runaway slaves' heads used to be displayed on the gate's iron spikes, and affixed to Fenwick is a sign that says whites only. Call this Louis a devil? He'll show you a devil. Of course he instantly regrets it. He is Louis after all, because his ghoulish act leads to race riots in Storyville. His club is firebombed, and the poor black side of town gets it worst with chaos in the streets, which Louis watches with horror from his window, while Lestat mentions that although this carnage was extreme even for his tastes, he's still so proud of Louis for finally embracing his vampire nature. Again, more, I guess. Louis claims that he only did it to stand up for his people and to fight oppression, but Lestat calls bullshit, asking Louis if he didn't feel pleasure while he was being so brutal. Louis is disgusted by the fact that Lestat is fawning over him for something he's so ashamed of doing, and he pulls away from him, saying that it's his fault people are raining terror in the streets. Lestat then reminds him of what he said at the beginning of the episode, that all people are equally capable of atrocity, and all Louis did was provide them the excuse. Everyone has the capacity to be an evildoer, and this proves it. But Louis hard disagrees, and he says that this difference in their philosophies of the nature of humanity is why he and Lestat will never work out, and why Lestat will always be alone. Calling us back to Lestat's moment of vulnerability when he took Louis to the opera and confessed his greatest fear was being alone, and that was why they must never part? Ouch, Louis. Low blow. As Louis storms away from him, we see the shock and fear of this on Lestat's face. I would say in his eyes, but thanks to the contact lenses, it's sadly almost impossible to ever see any emotion in these actors' eyes. But his entire frame goes rigid, and for the first time, Lestat's really scared he might actually lose Louis, and he doesn't understand why. A moment ago, he was convinced that Louis had finally embraced his vampire nature and they could be companions in the Dark Gift, which Louis did. He He definitely did go full vampire. But then he immediately walked it back, which, yes, Lestat, I'm as baffled as you are. Even though I really love most of the writing in this episode, this bit doesn't really land for me, and it's for exactly the same reason as the problem I had in episode 2. The natural logic of Louis's life circumstances, as set up by the show, are leading him in one direction: rage and rampage. But then the show remembers that it has to get back to checking off plot points from the book, so it circles back and goes, never mind, and now Louis is over it already, and again rejecting Lestat as the representation of the vampire. I guess they just wanted to get in their cool, violent, gory, vampire, badass action scene before we went back to the intimate domestic drama the story is supposed to be. It's fine if you go off book. It's your own show. Do what you want, but please just pick a direction and stay in it. So here, the meaning of the vampire has shifted from just being the opportunity for freedom and empowerment to becoming a full-out revenge fantasy. But like, in a bad way? What started off as hopeful and freeing, a nearly religious experience, has turned dark. The allure of the vampire is deceptive, a Faustian bargain that leads to damnation. And yet, the vampire is still human and still has feelings, and in fact, it is the opposite of freeing. True freedom would be for the monster to not feel bad about its monstrousness, but the essence of the vampire is that the soul and the conscience live on, resulting in a state of torture not unlike a living hell. The vampire is not the devil, but the devil's fool all along. So, racked with guilt and self-loathing for the riots he caused because his self-starvation left him too hungry to be thinking about the consequences of his actions earlier. Oopsie. Louis runs out into the streets, desperate to try to help the people in the poor neighborhood who are getting the worst of it. No one seems to want his help. He's just in the way, and he feels impotent and useless until his vampire hearing picks up the sound of a girl in a burning house crying out for help. He's like, yes, finally, I can help that one. He heroically dives into the burning building, braving fire, which is one of the very few things that can actually kill a vampire in this universe, unless the show's going to change that too. We don't know yet. And he tells us that the girl he finds there is his redemption. Dun dun dun! Claudia. The episode ends just as he reaches her, leaving us to have to wait until next week to find out what happens. I wonder what it could be. If you were thinking that Louis' dramatically whispered ending monologue here sounds a lot more natural than the ones delivered in the last 2 episodes, that's because this one is not, in fact, Anne Rice's writing at all. It is entirely original, and it shows, given how much better it meshes with the rest of the dialogue in the show. When Louis finds Claudia in the book, he feeds on her. One of his greatest sins that compounds his epic guilt. But the show has turned that meeting on its head. Now he is rescuing her and sees this act as redemption for his guilt. Not that his guilt over being a vampire or a brothel owner or all those other things he felt bad about before has been plaguing him much. The whole point of becoming a vampire was to shed that guilt and shame after all. Not that it really worked. But still, he was doing all right for a good long while, thought he had everything he ever wanted. But his guilt from starting the riots, that's fresh. And now, hey, redemption! That was fast. In the books, it's emphasized that redemption isn't a thing vampires can really achieve, and it's debated if it's even a thing that truly exists at all. But Louis is telling Daniel now that he's found it. Saving this girl is going to make up for all his sins. Or at least so he felt at the time. Think it'll last? I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and next week we get to talk all about Claudia and the Happy Murder family. Can't wait! Enjoying these videos, consider joining my Patreon and helping me make more of them. I would not be able to put any videos on YouTube if it was not for my Patreon patrons. Thank you all so much for all your support in all of my vampire shenanigans. You enable my horrible black heart. and I love you for it.